to the Jewish Policy Center conference call with Douglas Feith. I'm Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. I am especially happy to have Doug Feith with us this week to talk about events in and around Israel. He is one of the great resources in Washington. This is not his first appearance for the JPC. He was actually here 1 year ago, and we're really glad to have him back, which may be the reason we have a very large audience today. We are thrilled that you're here. We hope you keep sending that invitation to friends. I say it every week, but it's true. We have a lot of new people with us today, and so I'm going to introduce the work of the JPC. You know I would introduce it anyway, but this is my excuse. JPC is a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 1985, supporting a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security cooperation, and missile defense, especially Iron Dome. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them this day or any other day. As an organization that sits slightly to the right of center, the JPC advocates for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, and energy security, as well as free speech and intellectual diversity. You can sign up for our articles and see our magazine in Focus Quarterly by going to our website, jewishpolicycenter.org. And if you've missed some of our conference calls, each one ends up on the website. So I encourage you to look at jewishpolicycenter.org to see what you might have missed. We've had scholars and policymakers on issues, including various aspects of Israel and Middle East policy, including the Abraham Accords, some of the many and mostly threatening sides of China and Iran, with side trips on American defense, school choice, and the Supreme Court. We are back in the Middle East today. And before I introduce the speaker, let me remind you, you can use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen to send questions. We're monitoring during the program. Douglas Feith is Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute, where he works on a range of foreign and defense issues, including terrorism, arms control, alliance relations, national security policymaking, and the relationship between policy and intelligence. Military and political intelligence, I assume not smart people, although that works too. His projects at Hudson have examined US policy toward East and South Asia, Australia, Europe, and the Middle East. And in his spare time, he's writing a history of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I, for one, am really looking forward to. Doug served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy for the government in 2001 to August of 2005. His best-selling memoir, War and Decision, was published in 2008. While in the Defense Department, he helped plan worldwide changes in US defense posture, develop new strategic partnerships with India and Pakistan, promote NATO enlargement and reform, and craft a policy toward China. Doug wrote recently, and we're going to come back now to the Middle East in today's program. Doug wrote recently about the nature of Hamas, in which he noted, and Doug, this is going to come to you as your first question. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has warned against, quote, a false equivalence between a terrorist group, Hamas, that is indiscriminately launching rockets at civilians, and Israel, which is responding to those attacks. Meanwhile, Doug writes, President Joe Biden has so far prevented the United Nations Security Council from demanding an immediate Hamas-Israel ceasefire. This shows far more appreciation of Israel's strategic requirements than Secretary of State John Kerry and the Obama team displayed during the Hamas-Israel war 7 years ago. Kerry was pressing Israel for a ceasefire as if he was mediating between two friends of the United States, and his task was to arrange a win-win outcome. In contrast, writes Doug, key Biden team members seem to understand what Hamas is. Doug, what is Hamas? What do we need to know?
First of all, Shoshana, it's very nice to be with you again, and I'm an admirer of the Jewish Policy Center's work, so I'm happy to be here with you. You asked what Hamas is, and I think that the Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, put his finger on an important point by reminding people that the State Department has long ago labeled Hamas a terrorist organization. What Hamas is, in fact, is the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. And a little bit of background. Hamas was founded in 1988. So it's an organization of fairly recent vintage, and it published at its founding a document that it calls its covenant. And the covenant is a really important document to read for anybody who wants to understand Hamas or wants to understand the current war that Israel and Hamas are fighting in and across Gaza. What the covenant says is that Hamas is an acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement, and the covenant says that that the covenant itself clarifies the movement's picture, reveals its identity, outlines its stand, explains its aims, speaks about its hopes, and calls for its support, adoption, and joining its ranks. And it says, our struggle against the Jews is very great and very serious. Now, it may try the patience of some of the listeners, but I really think it's worth it to give a few key quotes from the Hamas covenant, because there's nothing like quoting them directly rather than characterizing them. Some people get very turned off when you label a group a terrorist group, because they say, well, terrorist is a subjective judgment and all the rest of it. I think it's important to let Hamas speak for itself. So let me give you a few quotations from the Hamas covenant. They said, there is no solution to the Palestinian problem except by jihad. The initiatives, operations, and international conferences are a waste of time and a kind of child's play. The covenant also says, the Islamic resistance movement is an outstanding type of Palestinian movement. It gives its loyalty to Allah, adopts Islam as a system of life, and works toward raising the banner of Allah on every inch of Palestine. It also says, even though the Islamic resistance movement looks forward to fulfill the promise of Allah, no matter how long it takes, because the Prophet of Allah says, the last hour would not come until the Muslims fight against the Jews and the Muslims would kill them, and until a stone or a tree would say, Muslim or servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. And two more items from the Hamas covenant. As far as the ideology of the Islamic resistance movement is concerned, giving up any part of Palestine is like giving up part of its religion. And finally, the covenant says, the motto of the Islamic resistance movement is, Allah is its goal, the messenger is its leader, the Quran is its constitution, jihad is its methodology, and death for the sake of Allah is its most coveted desire. Now, anybody who knows anything about the Middle East and the ideological organizations in the Middle East will recognize that this is the language of the Muslim Brotherhood, which was founded in the 1930s or late 20s, I forget exactly, in Egypt. And part of the reason that Israel and Egypt have such a cooperative partnership in dealing with Hamas is that the Egyptian government views as one of its main enemies in the world, the Muslim Brotherhood. And so it recognizes that Hamas, as the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, is a hostile organization. And that's the reason that it's not just Israel that has been blockading Gaza. Gaza also has a land boundary with Egypt, and Egypt is blockading Gaza. And there's substantial Israeli cooperation in trying to keep Hamas from getting weapons and building up its strength in Gaza, because Hamas uses that to support Muslim Brotherhood elements that are hostile to the Egyptian regime and not just hostile to Israel.
So this raises two questions from our listeners. One asked, so how does Hamas get weapons? And a lot of those weapons actually do get across the Egyptian border into Gaza. Uzi Rubin did a paper on this. Egyptian border guards make about 72 cents an hour. So although the Egyptian government's position is in line with the government of Israel, there's a lot of smuggling on that southern border. And the second listener, asks, where can we get a copy of the Hamas charter to read? Is that something they stick online, or do you have to be initiated to get it?
No, it's available online, and it's the Hamas Covenant, sometimes referred to as a charter, but I think I believe it calls itself a covenant, and it was published, as I said, in 1988, and it's easily available online. You just have to Google it. Now, on the question of where does Hamas get its arms from, Hamas gets financial support from Iran, among other places. And this is an interesting paradoxical situation, because as a Muslim Brotherhood organization, Hamas's ideology is very hostile to Shiite Islam. But as has been shown frequently in history, groups that are ideological opponents manage to occasionally create strategic alliances against common enemies, despite their ideological differences. As, for example, the Nazis and the Soviets did against Poland in the summer of 1939. And then after Hitler attacked the Soviet Union, the United States and the Soviet Union, despite their ideological differences, became allies against Hitler. So it's by no means unheard of that groups that are ideologically opposed to each other will find common cause in operations against their enemies. And the Iranians and the Shiite Iranians and the Sunni jihadist Hamas people are strategic partners against Israel. And the Iranians have worked to smuggle arms to Hamas in Gaza, and they've also provided technical support so that Hamas can manufacture weapons in Gaza using Iranian designs. And so through a combination of smuggling and domestic production, Hamas has managed to manufacture large numbers of rockets and missiles.
And one can assume that those rocket and missile factories are part of the infrastructure that the Israeli Air Force is now attempting to get rid of.
Yes, that's, I think, a major target for the Israelis. There's always this question of, how good is the intelligence? How much do the Israelis know about the location of these key facilities? And presumably the ones that they know about, they can destroy. But you don't always know what you don't know. And so when the Israelis claim that they've destroyed what they think is everything, that whether that's true or not depends on how good the Israeli information is. There's also the problem that Hamas, as a matter of practice, locates its military production facilities and its military operational bases in places so that if the Israelis attack those facilities, there will inevitably be large civilian casualties. And this is something that I think really deserves attention. because it is really, I believe, unique in history that a party to a war has as a major element of its strategy maximizing civilian deaths on its own side. I don't think in the entire history of war you can cite another example of a country that makes one of its fundamental strategic planks the maximization of civilian casualties on its own side. So Hamas is doing something that is really innovative and morally horrific.
Innovative and disgusting. That's interesting.
And I think it has not gotten anywhere near the attention that it deserves. And we can discuss that further if you'd like to.
Yeah, I'm going to give you my last question now, and then we'll go back to the other things that I have on the list, because you've opened up the door here. This morning, I think for the first time, at least I'm old and the first time that I can remember, the UN Special Coordinator for Middle East Peace and Security said openly, overtly, unequivocally that Hamas locating its military effects inside of civilian neighborhoods and firing into civilian neighborhoods in Israel is a war crime by international law, and it needs to stop immediately. I was thrilled. Is it a first for you?
It is surprising, and it may be the first time that that I can remember that a UN official would make a statement like that about Hamas and not, balance it with some kind of moral equivalency between Hamas and Israel. It may reflect the point that I just made, which is what Hamas is doing is not what is commonly described as using civilians as human shields. I think that is a terrible thing to do, and using civilian human shields is a war crime. But I think that what Hamas is doing is much worse than that. They're not merely using humans as a shield. They are purposefully maximizing civilian casualties on their own side at the same time that they're trying to maximize civilian casualties on the Israeli side. That's different from simply using their own people as a human shield. If you think about the evolution of the law of war, I mean, the law of war has, in its modern form, its main roots are in the 19th and looked to a large extent our concern to protect civilians in wartime. And that started at the time of the American Civil War, and it developed in the late 19th century, and then it developed further in and as a result of World War I. And it developed when had part groups like the resistance civilian clothes. There was an enormous folks that were operating against the Nazis wearing civilian clothes. There was a recognition that they operated in civilian clothes, they were endangered civilians. And so the 1940 Geneva Conventions, major discussion of in civilian, you're get the protection get if you operate in. Now, Hamas has taken that a gigantic leap further, tremendously setting back the cause of the humanitarian law of war by not only operating as terrorists, but purposefully locating their military facilities and military operations in civilian areas so that when the Israelis make legitimate attacks against their military assets, there inevitably have to be large civilian casualties on the Palestinian side. And this is such a terrible regression, such a terrible repudiation of the absolute heart of the idea of the law of war, that people who take the law of war seriously, and the UN likes to say that it does, need to recognize that what Hamas is doing here is not simply violating the law of war, they're setting it back centuries. And so perhaps that's what accounts for this extraordinary statement of condemnation by this UN official. We can only hope that the UN official is properly focused on this and understands how outrageous what Hamas is doing is.
Okay, so we have a bit of good news on the UN side, at least for the moment, at least one official. The General Assembly and the Security Council are both jumping to condemn Israel. But I would ask the question, has the Biden administration, presumably, the reason Hamas does this is because they understand that dead Palestinian civilians reflect badly on Israel rather than on themselves. And if you can turn the conversation to look at those horrible Israelis killing our children, that works for Hamas. The question is, does it work on the Biden administration? Because despite what you wrote in Times of Israel, which is now a couple of days old, the Biden administration appears to have walked back its support of Israel to some extent. And he is pushing for this ceasefire. And he's only pushing the Israelis because he has no leverage on Hamas. Have they been affected by the propaganda? Have they been affected by the Hamas tactic? Are they actually less inclined to defend Israel?
My sense is that the Biden team is putting out mixed signals. And the mixed signals may be a conscious tactic, or they may reflect the reality of different points of view within the Biden administration. And I suspect that the latter is a large part of the reason for the mixed signals. The Democratic Party right now has a vigorous debate underway between the wing that is represented by the so-called squad, the congressional representatives Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others. And that wing is intensely anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, very outspoken, and reasonably influential. It's a question of how influential they are within the Democratic caucus in Congress. They seem to be reasonably influential within the party. I don't know whether their influence is going to grow or shrink over time. I think they're in a real fight with Democrats who have more traditional views, and the more traditional views are generally pro-Israel, even though they tend to be quite hostile to Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Likud view of things. So you have this fight going on within the Democratic Party, and at the moment within the administration, the statements that both the president and the Secretary of State Blinken have made suggest that there's an understanding that Israel needs to reestablish deterrence against Hamas. And so the president and the Secretary of State have been giving Israel the time that it needs to punish Hamas for the rocket attacks against Israel and to diminish Hamas's military capabilities. And the combination could restore deterrence. And it's worth noting the last significant war between Israel and Hamas was in 2014. Here we are 7 years later. And the idea is that some people have is that the Israelis buy through major operations of the kind that they're now engaging in, they buy a few years of quiet, and then there'll be a flare up 3, 5, 7 years down the road, and they'll have to do this all over again. And that's at least the way the Israelis have been handling it in recent years. And it looks like Biden and Blinken are giving Israel time to do that. On the other hand, they're under pressure from abroad and pressure from within the Democratic Party to push Israel harder to stop the military operations. And I think as I said, they're trying to have it both ways by giving some lip service to the people who talk about ceasefire, but not actually demanding an immediate ceasefire and not allowing the UN to pass a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire. So that's where we seem to be at the moment.
So basically, a ceasefire that leaves Hamas in control of various aspects of its military setup means that Hamas gets to determine the timing of the next war as well, which it seems to me is an intolerable burden on Israel. And then Hamas starts the next war and Israel responds and then it gets a ceasefire and Hamas gets to do it all over again. It's really just a system for kicking the can down the road, isn't it? I don't know what the can is. I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah, no, that's one way of looking at it. There's a debate in Israel over military strategy. And when Israel withdrew, when Prime Minister Ariel Sharon decided that Israel was going to withdraw unilaterally from Gaza in 2005, it was an enormously controversial decision. It was so controversial that it lost Prime Minister Sharon his own political party. He didn't have the support of most of the Likud Knesset members, even though he was the head of Likud and he was a Likud prime minister. And when he lost the support of his own party, he created a new party, the Kadima party, and he remained prime minister, but he was not the Likud prime minister anymore. He was now the Kadima prime minister. And anyway, the withdrawal from Gaza was enormously controversial. Interestingly enough, as controversial as it was, once Israel got out, there was no substantial political support for Israel retaking Gaza. You don't hear anybody in Israel saying, we wish we controlled Gaza. And so the Israelis are constrained. They would like to destroy Hamas and destroy its capabilities, but they don't want to pay the price of taking over Gaza again to do that. And the question then is there a middle ground where the Israelis can go in on the ground, destroy Hamas, destroy the infrastructure, and then leave? And there's a general view that there would be large Israeli casualties if they did that, even larger Palestinian casualties, strong international condemnation, a loss of Israel's position in the world if they did that. And then if they pulled back and didn't run the place and left total chaos in their wake, they would be blamed for all the misery that Gaza goes through. Now, there are other people who say Israel gets blamed for that anyway. So given that they pay the price, they might as well get the benefit. And so there are some people who are arguing that the Israelis should go in on the ground, do the job they need to do, and their position in the world wouldn't be that much worse than it is now when they get denounced anyway. And maybe they could clean up the Hamas problem to a much greater extent than they could by just trying to fight it from outside. Anyway, that's a big strategic debate within Israel right now. And at the moment, Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to favor fighting Hamas from the outside and believes that the cost-benefit analysis argues for the Israeli strategy that is known as mowing the grass, which is they hit Hamas hard, they buy 2, 3, 5, or 7 years of peace, and then they have to hit Hamas all over again when Hamas starts another confrontation. But from the point of view of some people in Israel, and it seems to be including Prime Minister Netanyahu, that's a better strategy and a less costly strategy than trying to solve the problem with a major ground invasion.
It's a very important thing, I think, for our listeners to understand. And it answers 3 or 4 questions that we've gotten about what are the Israelis thinking and are they going to invade it on the ground? And that answers their question. It's important to understand, I think, also that there is no unanimity in Israel about what the problem is and what the proper means of address is. There is unanimity about what Hamas is, but what to do, not so much. And possibly the same problem on the northern front as Iran is kind of tweaking its Hezbollah allies as well. And you mentioned Iranian support for Hamas, and this leads us to another whole line of conversation about the American government. The Biden administration is very interested in a new deal with Iran. And in the course of pursuing that deal, they have decided openly to leave things off the table. Iranian human rights, the Iranian ballistic missile program, Iranian support for terrorism, including Hamas, but also the Houthis, removing some Trump-era sanctions. So the Biden administration has made it exceedingly clear what its goal in Iran is. Did that help to stoke this problem at this time, that both the Iranians and Hamas felt that they had a clear shot at Israel? Not at destroying Israel, I don't think they ever expected to, but at harassing Israel because they figured maybe the Biden people wouldn't bother them because they're too interested in the Iran deal?
I think that you have a slightly less clear picture than you've just painted of what the Biden administration wants regarding Iran. I think there are people in the Biden administration at senior levels who are precisely in line with the way you've described the administration's policy. But my sense is there are some people, perhaps Biden himself, who show at least some awareness that the world has changed in the years since the Obama administration made the Iran deal. And the world has changed in ways that have made Iran a lot weaker than it was 5, 6, 7 years ago. And the US unilateral sanctions on Iran were far more effective than almost anybody that I knew believed was possible. Most people, including people who are in favor of a very hard line toward Iran, like myself, believed that to be effective, US sanctions needed to be supported internationally, multilateralized, that the United States by itself would not be able to put a really effective squeeze on Iran. But the squeeze that the Trump administration put on unilaterally turned out to be far more effective than I believed was possible, and that almost anybody I know believed was possible. So you have to give the Trump administration credit. I'm not a big Trump fan, but I believe the Trump administration is entitled to enormous credit for having seen that unilateral US sanctions imposed in a very harsh fashion could be far more effective than almost all the experts said was possible. To give you an example of how effective they were, Iranian oil exports a little while ago were around 2.9, 3.0 million barrels a day. as a result of the economic sanctions imposed by the Trump administration, the oil exports went down from around 2.9 million barrels a day to 0.5 million barrels a day. Now that's stunning. And it devastated the value of the Iranian currency. It drove prices up throughout Iran, which created enormous political unhappiness and mass demonstrations against the regime. And the Iranians are absolutely on their knees economically. Now, there are people in the Biden administration who know that in entering into negotiations with the Iranians to revive the nuclear deal, they're dealing with Iranians who are on their knees economically. And so that allows for a somewhat harder line. Now, I think that the Biden administration is making a terrible mistake in trying to keep a narrow focus on the nuclear program rather than a broader focus on all of the Iranian activities that are adverse to American interests. I think it would be better to broaden the negotiations. And I also think it's a big mistake to talk about getting a deal that will relieve the Iranians rapidly of the economic pressure that we now have them under, because whatever hopes we have of concessions from the Iranians so that they'll back off on the activities that are harmful to us comes from the fact that they're under enormous economic pressure. So I think we should keep them under that economic pressure until we get what we want in the negotiations. And the strategy that the Biden administration has announced for negotiations with Iran doesn't take that properly into account. Nevertheless, they're not just rushing into a deal and relieving the economic pressure immediately. And it's possible that people in at least some leading people in the Biden administration are giving lip service to wanting to have a new agreement with the Iranians, while at the same time taking advantage of the Iranians' weakened position. And so far, we don't have a deal with Iran. And if the Biden administration maintains the position that they want one, but they can't achieve one, and in the meantime, they're keeping the Iranians under severe economic squeeze, that's not a terrible position. I mean, it's not as bad as it might be. And I mean, I'd feel better if they had a smarter declaratory position more in line with the more hard-headed position that's, some of the hawks are advocating. But you can't expect the Biden people to sound like hawks. That's not their political constituency.
No, but whether that gives aid and comfort to Hamas and its decisions to fire at Israel is still an open question.
Well, I think the main thing that is probably inspiring Hamas in this regard is, or one of the main things, is the Biden administration, I think, made a mistake in restoring economic aid to the Palestinians, despite continuing Palestinian support for terrorism. And that's the kind of thing that could have affected Hamas calculations that they would not pay a terribly severe price with the United States by launching this activity. I think they've probably been disappointed about this because the administration, as we talked about before, is giving Israel time and is not pushing them for an immediate ceasefire. But still, I think that the administration made an unconstructive signal by restoring aid to the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas may have misread that as a sign of possible sympathy for them. They got a lot of sympathy from John Kerry last time around in 2014, and they may have thought that the Kerry team has returned, and I would assume that if they believe that, they're somewhat disappointed now.
It's okay with me if they're disappointed. But you raise another important point here, which is we talk about the Hamas war against Israel and Israel's response, but a lot of this has to do with Hamas and Fatah and the cancellation of the scheduled Palestinian elections. Hamas now says that they demand that Israel leave the Temple Mount, and they demand that Israel stop evacuating people from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem, which is an entry by Hamas into the sort of political workings of what has historically been the Palestinian Authority's purview on the eastern side, in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. How much of this is maybe out of control violence, or violence that started low and got bigger, between Hamas and Fatah for control of the Palestinian, should we say, the Palestinian narrative?
Well, I think in understanding a phenomenon as large as war, you have to take a lot of things into account. And certainly the things that you just highlighted, I think, are an important element of the current politics that provides triggers and political opportunities for action by Hamas to score points against the Palestinian Authority, to make the leadership of the Palestinian Authority look not just corrupt, but old and tired and ineffectual. And so Hamas looks young and vigorous, and they're rising to the defense of Arab interests in Jerusalem. And so there is that politics going on between Hamas and the PLO people who run the Palestinian Authority. But it's extremely easy for people to, and journalists in particular, to fail to see the forest for the trees by focusing on these immediate political issues and triggers, and the dispute over the Sheikh Jarrah area of neighborhood of Jerusalem, or the clashes between the police and Arab demonstrators on the Temple Mount at the Al-Aqsa Mosque. When journalists say that those things triggered the war, it's as ignorant as people who believe that World War I was actually caused by the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo. Right? No serious person thinks that the actual cause of that great war was the particular incident that was taken advantage of to trigger the war. And no serious person should believe that the war between Hamas and Israel is fundamentally about rental payments in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood of Jerusalem. And that's the reason that I emphasize the importance of the Hamas covenant, and wanted to remind people to take a step back and see the strategic picture, and not just get lost in the details, the weeds of these small current disputes. Hamas is at war with Israel, not because of, as I said, rental payments in Sheikh Jarrah. They're at war with Israel because they fundamentally believe that Israel's existence is an offense against Islam and against the Arab people and against the Palestinian people, and that the only way to remedy the injustice and dishonor of Israel's existence is to put Israel out of existence. That's why there's a war between Hamas and Israel. And whether the Israelis are, there are no lack of excuses to go into active combat. Anytime that Hamas, for its own strategic reasons, wants combat against Israel, it can trigger that combat. And it can trigger that combat as easily as somebody walking around Israel can pick up a rock, right? There's no shortage of rocks to throw, and there's no shortage of incidents between Israelis and Palestinians that can be used as an excuse to trigger violence. So it's, I think, really misleading and ignorant and dishonest for journalists and government officials around the world to believe that what is motivating Hamas, which has a strategic commitment to Israel's destruction, is some petty quarrel that Hamas happens to cite for its own immediate political purposes. It's important to keep the big picture in mind.
First of all, I agree. And secondly, keeping the big picture in mind, we're coming sort of to the end of our conversation. And I think this has been enormously important to raise our eyeballs and to be looking at bigger things than local events on the ground and look at them in their larger context. So my last question, as regular listeners know, I try to ask a question, the answer to which will be positive so that we leave on a positive note. I don't know if you can do this, Doug, but here's a question I'm going to try. Someone sent in. Jen Psaki, the White House press secretary, called the Abraham Accords dead on arrival this week. She said they were not helpful and they were dead on arrival. Do you think so? Or do you think there is hope for Israel's relationships with the Gulf states that will extend beyond the fighting in Israel today and continue to provide benefits for both sides in the future?
I mean, the comment strikes me as really senseless.
There she is.
Well, it absolutely misses the point of the Abraham Accords. What the Abraham Accords represented was the strategic decision of countries in the Gulf that in the matter that most concerns them, which they view as a life and death matter, which is the Iranian threat to the United Arab Emirates, to Bahrain, to other countries in the Gulf, and to the Sunni Arab world in general, that with regard to the Iranian threat, the Israelis are enormously valuable and effective allies, and that is even more important to them than giving support to the Palestinian cause, especially because the Palestinian leadership is generally on the side of Iran, which really antagonizes the Gulf Arabs, and the Palestinian leadership is corrupt and ineffectual and doesn't serve the general interests of the Gulf Arabs. And so that was the real motivation for the Gulf Arabs to make this deal with Israel. Now, in making this deal, they were repudiating this long-standing view that the only way that the United States or Israel could make substantial diplomatic progress or increase strategic cooperation with the Gulf Arabs was by getting a settlement of the Palestinian issue. And that was a very long-standing view. It lasted for decades in the United States. And the Gulf Arabs said, it's not true. We're willing to make closer cooperation with Israel and with the United States to deal with the life and death problem of Iran, even if the Palestinians remain benighted and violent and pro-terrorist and unconstructive. So that was their view. So what's fascinating about the current fighting with Hamas is that it further proves the point that the Abraham Accords have their own strategic rationale unrelated to the Palestinians. And so, I mean, if anything, if anybody with his eyes open looks at the Abraham Accords and understands where they came from and where they are now, you'd have to say the current war is further proof that the Abraham Accords are sensible and that it doesn't make sense for the UAE or Bahrain or other Arab countries to subordinate their extremely important national security interests to Palestinian leaders who engage in damaging, violent, costly, and from a strategic point of view, purposeless attacks on Israel. And so, I mean, I think that the Psaki wrote precisely
Doug, you're frozen on our screen. We lost that last little bit, but we're going to, I consider that a positive answer to the question. I consider that a great close.
Am I now?
You're breaking up on us. So
Uh,
I think I'm going to thank you on behalf of the very large number of people that tuned in. Thank you for giving us a positive answer to the last question, because that really helps us move on to the next time. But most importantly, thank you for lifting our eyes to the broader strategic picture. I have to say, I completely agree with you, as I usually do, that it's not the little bits, it's the big picture that determines the future of the region and determines the way we should look at the future of the region. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and thank you for the number of questions. I'm going to try to take them off the Q&A and see if we can get Doug to answer a couple of them that I think are important after the program. Thank you for an excellent bunch of questions. Thank you, Doug, again for an excellent program, and we will see you next week. This is the JPC signing off.